In this lecture, we're going to be covering a very restricted portion of Chapter 9, which covers the entire nervous system. In this lecture, we're going to be restricting ourselves to the control of body movement, and primarily the aspects of control of body movement that deal with reflexes. So let's take a look at the objectives for this material, since we're restricting our attention to a very discrete portion of the chapter. I wanted to be sure that it's clear what I expect you to understand. First of all, you should be able to describe the following material. First, be able to define a reflex arc. What is a reflex arc? And then to be able to describe the following reflex pathways: the muscle spindle stretch reflex, the withdrawal reflex, and the crossed extensor reflex. So what is a reflex? Well, it's an automatic patterned response to a stimulus. Automatic meaning it requires no thought. It is something that happens without conscious thought. Patterned in that there is a sequence of events that happens in a reflex that is not varied. It's hardwired into the synapses of the reflex arc itself, and we'll be talking about that in a few moments. So it's a reflex is an automatic, invariant response to a stimulus. A reflex arc is important for several reasons. One is to understand each of the reflexes that we'll talk about. But in a more general standpoint, a reflex arc in some ways recapitulates the general theme of homeostasis. From a standpoint that you have some sort of a stimulus, you have a response to that stimulus, which is controlled by an integration center. And this is a theme that we saw way back in the beginning of the course. But when we talk about a reflex arc, and it's called an arc because there's this sort of arc-like arrangement of the components, it's a neural pathway that controls a reflex. And when we say a neural pathway, what we mean is that there's some sort of a sensory receptor that is associated with an afferent neuron. We've talked about these concepts in sensory physiology. There is an integration center that receives this input and that coordinates the appropriate response by activating efferent neurons, which in turn have an effect on some sort of an effector organ to produce a response that's appropriate for the original stimulus. So the components of it are the sensory receptor, an afferent neuron, an integration center, which is generally in the central nervous system. And for the two reflexes we'll be talking about, they are in fact in the spinal cord. An efferent neuron, in this case be motor neurons, as they are in most cases, and an effector organ that responds to the input from that effector neuron. So look at the stretch reflex. The stretch reflex, first of all, is a response to stretch, in this particular case, of the quadriceps. This is also sometimes called the knee-jerk reflex because, in fact, it elicits a jerking motion when we tap on the knee. But the important thing here is that stretch of the quadriceps. The stretch is activating muscle spindle afferents, which we talked about in a previous lecture. So the stimulus is activating a specialized sensory receptor, which is the muscle spindle, which of course is attached to an afferent neuron. And this response is an extension of the lower leg. That is, when the stimulus is applied, a gentle tap to the patellar tendon, it stretches the quadricep muscle. So we have stretching along the muscle here. And this causes the leg to extend outward. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this reflex generally is inhibited when the nervous system is intact. So you don't generally expect to see a vigorous response such as shown here if you tried it on yourself or on someone else. This test is actually used by neurologists to examine the presence of damage above the level of the spinal cord. But the response itself consists of a contraction of the quadriceps and a relaxation of the hamstring muscle. And this, of course, because we have contraction here with no contraction of the hamstring, this is going to pull on the insertion point here of the patellar tendon, swinging the lower leg upward. Now let's take a look at this diagram in a larger mode on the next slide. So we have the stimulus stretch here of the entire quadriceps. Now keep in mind, even though we're tapping on the patellar tendon, this is not due to activation of the Golgi tendon organ. What it's doing is it's actually pulling this muscle outward by tugging on the patellar tendon. And of course, stretch of a muscle activates the muscle spindle, which is then going to cause an action potential to arise here in the afferent neuron. Now this action potential is going to, of course, cause release of neurotransmitter at this synapse here. And this neurotransmitter is going to be excitatory onto the motor neuron going back out to the quadriceps. So when we stretch the muscle, this is actually going to cause a reflex contraction of the muscle. And of course, this is what muscle spindles are supposed to do. The idea is that the muscle spindle detects stretch on the muscle, which indicates that the muscle tension does not meet the load that's being applied to the muscle. So it causes the muscle to contract as a way of having muscle tension match the load that's being applied. And of course, in this case, we're not actually applying a load in terms of something that the muscle's trying to lift. We're sort of applying an artificial stimulus, but it still stretches the muscle the same way a load would. So that part of the reflex is pretty straightforward. The other part is how do we get the hamstring muscle to relax? Well, again, we have the stretch here, activation muscle spindle, sets up an action potential in the afferent neuron. And again, it releases a neurotransmitter, which in the case of the quadriceps, produce an excitatory response. It does here as well. It's going to excite this little interneuron. This little interneuron that's located here in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. But this is an inhibitory interneuron, meaning that when it is excited, it is going to release a neurotransmitter that will then inhibit the efferent motor neuron going out to the hamstrings. Now, it probably does this by releasing a neurotransmitter such as GABA, which is inhibitory. GABA activates GABA receptors, and GABA receptors are ligand-gated ion channels that allow chloride ions to flow into a neuron. And of course, that hyperpolarizes the neuron. So this interneuron here is going to cause a hyperpolarization of the efferent neuron, the motor neuron, going out to the hamstrings, which of course will allow the hamstring to relax. And again, this is automatic. It requires no conscious thought whatsoever, and it's patterned. The efferent motor neuron going to the quadricep will always be activated, and the efferent neuron going to the hamstring will always be inhibited. This is the simplest reflex arc. This is a more complicated one. There are two reflexes we're dealing with here. One is the withdrawal reflex. The other one is the crossed extensor reflex, and they generally are activated together. So in this case, the stimulus is activation by a nociceptor. Nociceptor is a pain afferent. And in this case, the stimulus is either a tack or a nail, something sharp that would be painful if the individual were to step on it. And the nociceptor afferent, that is this neuron here, is going to synapse onto 4 different interneurons. And it's going to cause two things to happen. It's going to cause flexion of the stimulated limb. That is, rather than continuing to push forward and apply pressure on the individual's right leg here, the right leg will be flexed as a way of pulling it away from the painful stimulus. So this is the withdrawal reflex. The right leg is being withdrawn from the stimulus that was painful. For this to happen, we have an excitatory interneuron that is going to activate the hamstrings and an inhibitory interneuron that's going to inhibit the quadriceps. Now these are shown here. This is the excitatory interneuron that is going to activate the hamstring. And this is the inhibitory interneuron that is going to inhibit the quadricep, and this causes withdrawal by causing flexion of the stimulated limb. Now, that makes sense. It's fairly straightforward. But consider the fact that this person had forward momentum and is beginning to apply weight to the right leg. You can't withdraw the right leg while you're trying to apply weight to it without falling down. So we have the crossed extensor reflex. It's called crossed because it actually uses neurons that cross the midline, going to the contralateral limb. And while we're flexing the stimulated limb, we need to extend the other limb as a way to transfer the weight back onto it so that the person doesn't fall down. So the extension of the contralateral limb is produced by a couple of other interneurons again. Interneuron 3 is an excitatory interneuron that's going to activate the quadriceps. And interneuron number 4 is an inhibitory interneuron that's going to inhibit the hamstring. So we're extending this limb to put weight on it. So the only thing that's more complicated about this reflex than the muscle spindle or stretch reflex is that we now have a collection of 4 different interneurons. The point to the study of reflexes is that we have here just several synapses producing a fairly complicated response. And it's much easier to understand than more complicated processes that would go on in the central nervous system. So reflexes are used not only as a way of understanding how synaptic organization can produce complicated behaviors, but as a more simple model of understanding even more complicated types of behaviors. Now, the other thing with this reflex is that we have neuron 5 here. This is also receiving input from the afferent, but neuron 5 is going up to the thalamus, and this is going to permit conscious perception of the stimulus. But it's important to realize that if you were dependent upon this activation of the thalamus, then to send some sort of activity down to the spinal cord to produce the same sort of response, it would take far too long. That the individual would, in fact, probably continue to step on the nail and have some injury, or would certainly not engage in a defensive response that would change weight to the opposite leg. So the other advantage of a reflex is that they are very, very fast because they don't require any conscious thought. They're immediate response to a stimulus, and therefore are much more valuable than some type of behavior that would require integration higher up in the brain and conscious thought as a way of activating the response to the stimulus.